بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
So moving on to today's topic, inshallah, I'm just going to provide just a few opening remarks from my end. Abbas will inshallah then provide his opening remarks, and just a little bit about ourselves. Maybe when we do sort of take on these more community-oriented projects, maybe you don't all get to see the other side of us, alhamdulillah. But Abbas and I are both studying a master's program in the government department at the London School of Economics, LSE. So we usually see each other in online classes. So it's nice to see each other in this particular environment. So a lot of the causes that we'll be talking about today and the way that the political world works and how we can kind of embed ourselves in it and bring about positive change is something that Abbas, through a lot of his work, with the refugees, with the homeless, has been trying a lot of work to do, and with myself through my own research and my journalism and whatnot, is something that I'm very passionate about too. And we do hope that, through this discussion that other kids can also, try to take a greater interest in politics and in current affairs, particularly, with what's happening around the world in terms of the Shia community who have been persecuted, in terms of Muslims in general as well, and even non-Muslims as well, that might be the victims of any humanitarian crises. So inshallah, after Abbas and I introduce, we're going to have an interactive dialogue. So please do raise your hand if you wish to unmute yourself. Then you can, inshallah, get involved in the discussion. And you can also put your questions in the chat box and we will, inshallah, endeavor to answer them. So very briefly, I know I've spoken quite a bit, but like I said, it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. And I did start off with the recitation of Surah Al-Fajr, which is one of the most beautiful surahs in the Quran, one that I love very, very much. And in terms of, the first few verses, so verses 6 to 14, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us, speaks to the reader, of the Holy Quran. He says, have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad, with Iram, the likes of whom have never been created in the land, with Thamud, with Fir'aun. And Allah says in verse 11, all of whom oppressed within the lands and increased therein the corruption. So your Lord poured upon them a scourge of punishment. Indeed, your Lord is in observation. So when we speak about a lot of these topics today, whether it's a government, whether it's a non-state entity, some of which I'll specify in a second, that is either directly committing these atrocities or indirectly by funding, for example, through military means, through financial means. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala proves to us through the Holy Quran that those of us that are oppressors will be dealt with either in this world or the hereafter. We all know that many of these, and Abbas would be better placed to speak about this, but the people of Ad, the people of Thamud, Fir'aun, the Pharaoh, who himself would say, I'm God, Allah dealt with them and punished them very, very severely. And that's in the Quran, not just as a story, but as actually something that we can perhaps take solace from, to know that these oppressive dictators and, regimes and groups will be dealt with either in this world or the hereafter. And then Allah then very interestingly discusses how we are as, people self-centered. Allah says that we don't treat the orphan fairly, we don't feed the poor, as in a sort of form of rhetorical questioning, and that only when the day of judgment comes, that's when we'll realize our failure to adhere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command. So it's very much a surah that I myself, and I tell myself first, that we should all be pondering over, in order to self-reflect and see, am I just sitting here, not doing anything, not giving charity, not helping out the poor, not helping out the orphans, not speaking out for their rights? Am I very happy sitting here in South London, not doing anything and saying, inshallah, Allah will look after them, or, their governments or whatever, right? Allah is telling us that we also have a responsibility in order to support those in need, whether they're on our doorstep, those homeless people that, for example, Al-Noor support, that charities like Imam Zamana Trust, support around the world, or anyone else. We can always make a change. To say that, we're just sitting here, that governments make all the decisions, we can't make any change. If the great revolutionaries throughout history like Ayatollah Khomeini, for example. If he thought like that, we wouldn't have had this revolutionary fervor that overthrew the Shah of Iran, for example. And here you can see where a lot of my passion for history and politics comes in, and maybe something we can, inshallah, bring out a little bit. So I just wanted to provide a few statistics so that we know what it is that we're dealing with, what it is that's currently going on in the world, and then Abbas will inshallah be able to provide a more analytical perspective. So firstly, as we know, there's been a recent escalation in tensions in Palestine. So around from 8th, 9th of May, for 11 days, we saw a bombardment of Gaza by the Israeli regime, in which 230 people at least were killed. At least 70 of these were children. And the youngest of these children was only 6 months old. And very often you saw that there were, for example, airstrikes, on a community, on a hospital, on a school that would kill 4 or 5 or 6 people from one family. There it's not like, a lot of the people are very crammed. Gaza is such a small piece of land, right? It's the most densely populated piece of land in the world, and it's got 2 million people in it. When an airstrike hits, people are going to die in big numbers. We've also seen in Afghanistan, and by the way, it's no surprise that people, governments and groups tend to attack in Shahr Ramadan. So in Afghanistan, on the 8th of May, which was towards the end of Shahr Ramadan, we saw, unfortunately, and very, very tragically, a series of bombings outside the Sayyid al-Shuhada school in the Shia neighborhood of Dasht-e-Barchi in Kabul. And this neighborhood mainly populated by ethnic Hazaras who are also Shia. At least 85 people were killed, and predominantly they were schoolgirls aged 11 to 15. And almost 150 people were injured. And one of the affiliates of ISIS claims to have carried out this attack, and the Taliban as well have been very much, these past number of years, sort of 20, 25 years since they took power in the wake of the Afghan civil war, they have embarked on this campaign of ethnic cleansing against Shias especially, but also against others as well. And finally, I would like to bring up Yemen, which is currently the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. About 80% of Yemen's population of 24 million people are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, and an estimated 2 million children are acutely malnourished, which is just shocking. If you consider the number of children that, there are a few, 3, 4, 5 million children, a very large proportion of these 2 million children are acutely malnourished. And I believe the UN have said that if the situation doesn't dissipate in the next few months, Yemen will have or suffer the worst famine that mankind has experienced in the last 100 years. That's going back to the first World War. That is a very long time ago, right? And I'm sure none of us or our family members were even born then. So that's ridiculous to sort of think about. And obviously you also see in China with the oppression of our Uyghur brothers and sisters, with this ongoing civil war in Syria that's been going on for 10 years and doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. You see the persecution of Muslims in Kashmir by the Modi regime. You've seen what's happened in Myanmar to the Rohingyas, right? And the ethnic cleansing and forced displacement of the Rohingya population in Myanmar, or Burma, as some of us call it. So this is what we're currently working with. And Abbas, who I'll now hand over to, will inshallah speak a little bit about what our Aqidah says in terms of combating these problems and what our duty and our responsibility is in order to solve these crises that we are currently experiencing. So inshallah, I'd like to now hand over to Brother Abbas. For sure, thank you very much for joining us, Brother Abbas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kazim. Thank you for the introduction. Super helpful. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا مولانا حبيب الله العالمين أبو القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على القوم الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. Thank you for tuning into this program. It's so important that we have it, and I thank Al-Muntazir Network for being perceptive enough to decide to structure it in this way. So inshallah we can all, benefit from this topic. About 9 years ago, a scholar in Saudi Arabia whose name means the tiger, is arrested. And he's arrested under the charge of misleading and causing revolt in the land and put into prison, along with many other Shi'i activists in Saudi Arabia in the Qatif and Hijaz region, to be later assassinated via execution. A few years later, in Nigeria, another scholar with a very different story also gets arrested in 2016. His claim is that he has led a movement in this country which has seen the number of Shia grow from 0 to 3 million in about 2 generations. And for this reason, he's arrested. 6 of his children are killed in front of him, more are arrested, and he too is arrested and beaten. In between this time period, the Arab Spring has erupted, and the people of Bahrain decide that they will try as well. But unlike in Tunisia and Egypt and other countries where they had at least some initial success, the Bahraini regime, with the support of the West and Saudi Arabia and a massive coalition when well funded, extends itself to not only try to destroy this movement, but target and expel individuals who are its leaders, knowing which school they go to, which jobs they participate in, and what their civil engagement is in. During this time in Iraq, we see a continuation of the oppression of the Mu'mineen, which has begun generations ago. This time, a new force arrives in this land claiming to make a new state. And one of their core tenets and features of this state is the destruction of the Shi'i people, the destruction of the shrines of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, and any companions who seem to be favorable towards the thinking of Ahlul Bayt. And so they target military generals in the Spiker massacre. They march towards Najaf, Al-Ashraf, and they go into Syria to march towards Sayyidah Zainab sallallahu alayha, hoping to attack the people there. As this is extending, we then zoom out and look at the wider region. We see individuals targeted in different countries which seem to have a common theme. A revert in Egypt who became a scholar who attacked the Salafi doctrine is not only attacked and assassinated, but his body is paraded around the town of Cairo. In Pakistan, one of the most celebrated professors, academics, and poets of our community is watched, observed, and targeted on his way to work, killed in cold blood. During this time, a state which had no existence over 100 years ago extends itself, increasingly attacking the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza, the people in the surrounding regions, and pushes northwards where the Mu'mineen of South Lebanon resist. And during this time, we then see the most diabolical airstrike regime which transforms the land of Yemen into a humanitarian disaster, the greatest catastrophe that we are seeing in front of our eyes in a matter of years. And then there's a school in Kabul, a school of young girls who are trying to follow this religion, ethnically Hazara, who are targeted. And parents must now learn what it's like to carry the corpses of children and carry the lightest coffins, which for them feel like the heaviest weights. All of these events we have gone through are connected. They are linked. They are of the same origin and they share the same themes, whether it's ideologically, whether it's by policy, whether it's by funding. These events don't occur in isolation. There is a global campaign which we start to piece together, which is happening all around us and unfolding in front of our eyes. During this time, and the more general time period of the 21st century and the 20th century, whilst this oppression is going on, while shrines are being attacked, while Baqi has been restricted access to all people, Muslims start migrating from the West going to the East. From the East going to the West, for the first time outside of the imperial time. The first wave of migration is Muslims from Iraq and Pakistan and India who leave their homes searching for a better life, from Iraq leaving oppression, and from India, Pakistan because they are searching economic prosperity. And they arrive in places like England, France, Canada, America, and they settle. This first wave are then joined by a wave of Khoja migrants who are leaving places like East Africa and Pakistan and also settling in these same countries. The priority of this first wave is survival. Life is hard in the West for a migrant. There are very few rights and there are very few jobs. And so they decide the priority should be getting good jobs, getting businesses, making a strong foundation so that one day there could be a community which spreads. The second generation grows. In the life of the second generation, they see the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And now their deen has asked of them not only to be passive in their worship, but active. And they're seeing around them ulama like Ayatollah Khomeini, like Shahid Mutahari, like Ali Shariati, like these scholars and these academics who are rising, who are teaching that the message of Islam is not something which requires you to stay silent. You must stand up. And if you're in the West, you have a responsibility. And so this second wave starts to become more religiously active in places like the UK and Canada and America, and establishes mosques and centers of learning to try and decide that we are going to be active Muslims in the West. Our religion is becoming our priority. And then grows the third generation from the hard work of the first two. And now children are growing up with safe economic families, with a foundation in the West, with British citizenship, with British lives, and they associate themselves with this country and with the West. And now they ask the question, the most important question, which is when I look at these systemic problems facing my people around the world, when I look at the example of Sheikh Nimr, of Sheikh Zagzaki, of the Bahraini people, when I look at the martyrdom of Sibta Ja'far, Shaheed, of Sheikh Hassan Shahata, when I see what's happening in Palestine, when I see what's happening in Lebanon, when I see what's happening in Yemen, when I see what's happening in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, and in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Kashmir, what becomes my responsibility? This question, which now we're able to ask, only occurs because we have the ability and we have our survival to think big. And how we answer this question is determined by where we get our answers from. What is my responsibility now in the West? What must I do when I look at these systemic issues? And here comes our topic of today, which is a Shi'i philosophy of activism. What does it mean to be an activist from the Shi'i school of thought? How does our religion help us to know how to answer these questions and create for us obligations and responsibilities which we must do in the West? There are many dimensions to go through in this topic, including how Abu Abdullah inspires us to answer this question, including what it means to be an activist in the Islamic tradition using Quran and our principles, including how do we identify genocide, how do we as Shias relate to other struggles like perhaps Palestine and others, and how do we find the delicate balance between talking and acting. These are many issues which we can discuss in today's event, inshallah, but I will leave my opening remarks there. And I will ask if you have any thoughts or contributions during this program, like Brother Kazim said, give us your views, your perspectives, because this conversation is only fruitful if we compare perspectives. And it may be that you've observed something in the issues we're discussing, which we need to prioritize. And it may be that me and Kazim have researched an issue which prompts an idea in yourself. So as I end, I encourage all of you, inshallah, to engage with this topic and allow us to think about your views as well. That's me, Kazim.
Thank you very much, Brother Abbas. I really liked the sort of the raw emotion I think that was there in your narrative, because it does demonstrate the scale of atrocities that we've been seeing very recently, especially against Shias. Okay, so I wanted to first, I think, bring up this topic of Shia genocide with what's happening against the Shias. And then we can maybe speak a little bit more generally, because I don't think it's just a case that if Shias are being oppressed, that we should just support them. And if our Sunni brothers and sisters in Palestine, for example, are being oppressed, we should forget them, which isn't what we've done, by the way. Al-Quds Day was formed by Ayatollah Khomeini, right? And you've traditionally seen Shia governments and political entities and movements are the ones at the forefront of supporting the Palestinian cause, the transnational Palestinian movement, whereas you've seen many of the other so-called Muslim governments in the Middle East that have very much abandoned the Palestinian people and are now cozying up to Israel. And that's a bit of a problem. But I think for now, I think if we take the topic of Shia genocide, and I know, mashallah, you did a whole podcast on it, which I would encourage everyone listens to, and I'll share the link towards the end. I mean, how would you summarize this sort of immense hatred of governments, for example, of armed groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like the Taliban, towards Shias? Why is it that Shias tend to always be targeted? Why is it that Baqi was blown up or desecrated? Why is it that in 2006, the Golden Dome of the shrine of the 10th and 11th Imam in Samarra was blown up? Why is it that till today we're worried about our safety when it comes to going on ziyarat to Iraq, that we might get caught in some sort of a crossfire or a particular attack? Yeah, if you could please elaborate a little bit more on this, I think that would be great. Inshallah.
Yeah, definitely. So the reason why we begin with the Shi'i perspective and then we expand outwards is not because we are prioritizing or belittling other struggles. Rather, it's because we are in a state of our own survival being compromised. So we have to understand, like, how do we secure our existence so that we're strong enough to help other struggles? And through that process, we no longer see other struggles as separate to us. Like say Sistani said, when you speak about Sunni, say they are anfusihim, they are from yourselves. Don't say they are separate to you. But you can't say anything whilst you're being drowned by oppression. So knowing why we should be activists is the first step. Why do we need to be like this? And survival is a really good answer to that, because in answer to your question, through history, we know what it's like to be oppressed. We know what it feels like. We have gone through it generation after generation. Since the death of our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have not had a moment of peace for Ahl al-Bayt. Days after we saw the tragedy of Sayyid Fatima sallallahu alaiha, not long after we see how difficult the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam becomes during the Khilafah of others, the oppression of Shi'as which happens during that time. For example, Abu Dharr al-Ghafari, who is expelled in front of the eyes of the Imam, one of the closest companions who is oppressed in this way. And then we have a very short time period of the Imam's own Khilafah, Imam Ali alayhi salam, only a few years, maybe 3.5 to 4 years, which is filled with difficulty, to the extent where the community comes together to oppress him and his followers. They all come together to cut ties from him. And then after that, we see the oppression of his followers, culminating, of course, in the event of Ashura. And since then, there has not been a moment of peace for us. Whether it is the life of the Imams, the attacks on the Mu'mineen during the Ghaibat al-Sughra, or the inability for us to gain any recognition in empires or movements in the time of Ghaibat al-Kubra. Maybe the revolution is one exception to this, or maybe the Fatimid time, but really, we have been oppressed throughout this time period in different dimensions. So we know what it feels like to be oppressed. That's why when we see the Palestinian struggle and we see the walls they have built around them, that seems very familiar. When we see that they are attacking children, we know what it's like to remember children who are killed, because we do it every Muharram. And we relate to these struggles. But with the wisdom of the ulama from before, including Imam Khomeini, he observed that the struggle of Palestine, for example, is not just a struggle which we identify with. It represents our struggle as well, because it has become the battlefield for the very ideologies which we are facing, which have oppressed us for many years, including the idea of Wahhabism, which supports the state of Israel, of imperialism, which Israel is a colonial settlement state. Imperialism is the very entity which has taken away so much of our development in the previous years. And the idea of modernity conflicting with traditional life. So the idea that the West represents science and progress and atheistic development, and the East represents backwards religion and tradition and things which are no longer applicable in modern life. And here comes a state in front of our eyes which represents modernity over traditional, where we abandon where our homes were. We still have the keys to houses which no longer exist. We observe rivers being dug up, and houses and settlements built upon the houses of others. And we see people break into each other's property. An Israeli breaks into the Palestinian property and says, when he's asked, why are you taking this land? Because he replies that if I don't, someone else will. And this mentality develops. So now it represents something much more than just the people there. It represents the very idea of resistance. And Palestine is a very specific struggle, but because we know what it feels like to be oppressed, we have gone through it so much, we can identify with Uyghur Muslims because we see similarity in them. We can identify with the Muslims of Kashmir, even if they're not Shia, those who are not. because we go through what it feels like. So in answer to your question, Shia genocide gives us a basis to recognize ourselves, by which we then have a compassionate eye to recognize others and build solidarity with them.
And I can see a question in the chat, which I'll come on to in a minute, inshallah. I would ask that, everyone ask their questions, even if you want to unmute and ask a question in Hindi or Urdu or whatever language floats your boat, then that's fine as well. And we want this to be a forum where we can have this particular discussion. So I think just building on what you said, and you made some really great points that I do want to draw on. And you made a point as well in your opening remarks when it comes to Imam Khomeini rahmatullah alayhi, and how he became this bastion for change, how he brought about this more political view of Shiism predicated on activism and standing up against the zalim, the oppressor, and protecting and empowering the downtrodden, the mustazafin, right, as they are called. So if Shia genocide has been going on for the last 1200, 1400 years, why is it that it took so long for someone to stand up against the government of their time? And again, I'm not criticizing many of our scholars, but you had the likes of Ayatollah Khoi, correct me if I'm wrong, that and Ayatollah Sistani as well, bar a few exceptions, that have tended to focus more on the jurisprudential side and not get involved. You didn't see them, rising up during the time of the Ba'athists saying, we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein because he's massacring Shias. You didn't see that. So why is it that there is this sort of dichotomy between the more politicized clerical class that you see have grown in for these past few years, but bearing in mind that Imam Khomeini was in Najaf for many years too, and the more the Najafi scholars that tend to be a little bit more quietist? Is this more of a political difference, or is it more of a theological difference in your view?
I think it's neither. I think it's jurisprudential. I don't think it's political, because these are different countries with different conditions, and the Islamic Revolution has its own historical context, which is also separate to Islamic development as well. It's about colonialism in addition to all of those things. It's about the idea of uprising against a ruler in the time of the Soviet era, for example. Like, there's loads of other conditions. And I don't think it's theological, because we are all from the same school. And this is not necessarily a difference of opinion when it comes to our aqaid. This is a question of fiqh. Because remember, Imam Khomeini was, before a political leader, he was a faqih. And the theory of wilayat al-faqih comes from his own ijtihad. He looked at the sources, he looked at the Quran, he looked at ahadith, and he found a basis for establishing a state, which was evident in concepts like adl, mustad'afin, like you mentioned, jihad, in eschatology, the coming of the Imam, and so many different views of the idea of having a bilad or a hakim or the application of the sharia. Like, so many reasons, he brought them together into a theory. This theory existed before him. His novelty is in the nature of the state which he theorized, the way the government looks, but also in the mechanism to implement it, which comes through jihad, or comes through recognition that we can have wilayat al-faqih al-mutlaq. That's his contribution. What that implies is, before Imam Khomeini, we have so many reasons why we should have a state. What we don't have is the imperative to make a state when you have the opportunity. We don't have that. He comes along and in his reasoning of the state argues that if you have the opportunity, you can extend the power of the faqih more than just shar'an, but also for siyasi. And more than siyasat, also for declaring harb, declaring war on defensive grounds. When he extends that mutlaq, that open definition, that means that when the chance comes, he believes in the idea of a state. So when 1979 comes and we've had the developing tension in the country and the Shah is in his weakest position, he's ready. He's ready to implement what he had already been arguing for many years in Najaf, like you correctly mentioned, in Iran, in Paris, wherever. All of this was happening before the opportunity for a state even came around. It was all a fiqh discussion. And the reason why I wanted to mention this is because ideas that we are now following are Islamic ideas, like being an activist. These are not political ideas only. They come from our sources. So what I will do is I'll pause for a second. I'll let you speak on the political dimensions, and then I'll come back in with our sources. So to flick that same question to you, Kazim, how do we see the revolution and Imam Khomeini's movement being something new in politics. Is something seems quite distinct to our eyes. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, it was very distinct. And since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and even before then, before that, in this modern world of nation states, we haven't seen a successful revolution that's actually established an Islamic state, which is very, very interesting. And to me, it sort of shows that when you have a pure niyyah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supports you, then there is no reason why your movement can't succeed. And Ayatollah Khomeini started from, very humble beginnings. He came from as far as I know, a scholarly family. And, he was mainly delivering sermons, for example, in Najaf, to which he was exiled after he started to speak out against the Shah in the 1960s, who was, introducing increasingly secular reforms. His cassettes were distributed to Hawza students, in Iran and Iraq as well. But he really captured the imagination of the people. And it was very much to do, I think, a lot with his leadership, his charisma. And we often forget that around the time of the revolution, there's this iconic image of him coming off this Air France plane in Tehran in February 1979, after the Shah had abdicated, to take over the position as the leader of Iran. And he was so frail, he was pushing 80 years old. When he died about 9 years after the revolution, 10 years after the revolution, he was pushing 90. But he clearly was on this mission, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supported him. And since then, we've seen the likes of Sheikh Zakzaki, Ayatollah Nimr, both of whom have been very heavily persecuted. So Sheikh Zakzaki, many of his sons have been killed. He's been very badly injured. Of course, Ayatollah Nimr in 2016 was executed by the Saudi regime. So he's brought about this change in Shi'ism, which Vali Nasser, who's a very prominent scholar in this area, he's written an amazing book called The Shia Revival. And I know, Abbas, you and I were discussing that, and some of the views that he makes are perhaps quite, or that he possesses are maybe quite Orientalist, very, very westernized, but nevertheless, I think it's a good overview. So The Shia Revival by Vali Nasser is a book that I'd highly recommend. And he shows how Ayatollah Khomeini brought about this seismic change, where Shias in Iraq, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Lebanon, we had with the creation of Hezbollah. And it's weird. Now, you see, Hezbollah having been designated as a terrorist organization, and you can't even speak about them anymore. But we're talking from an academic perspective, right? That this brought about this change in Shiism that we've seen in the past 40 or 50 years. I think before that, and this is maybe, again, coming back to you, that to me, it does depend quite a bit on the political circumstances, in the sense that, Shias make up 99% or whatever of the Iranian population. And that clearly facilitated change. There was the weaknesses of the Shah's leadership as well. So I think, even to me, and this is something I'll put back to you, that we saw with Imam Hussein being this revolutionary that stood up against Yazid, but you had other Imams like Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, who, as far as I know, brought in the implementation of taqiyya, who was very much focused on, university education, for example. So I mean, when we look at the distinguishing, for example, Iran and Iraq and the different political circumstances there, could you also say that the time of Imam Hussein, for example, and Imam Hassan was very different to Imam Sadiq and the Imams that followed him, those that were during the time of the Abbasids, who were particularly violent towards Shias? Is that a view that you would sort of subscribe to, or do you have anything else to add in regards to that?
Yeah, so I think in order to speak about the Imamate period, let's take a step back from the revolution for a moment, and let's take a step back from application, so we can just look at the Imams themselves. And then we can see how Imam Khomeini spoke about them, or how other movements referred back to them, okay? What you're mentioning, guys, goes back to a distinction people say between the Hassani and Husseini approach. What they say is that when the Holy Prophet said that in that narration, that my sons Hassan and Hussein are Imams, whether they sit or stand, people say this interpretation is whether or not they are doing the Hassani approach, which is conciliation, sulh, patience, teaching, education, what the Imams will do later. They have that approach. That's one. And the Husseini approach is another, where you have uprising, you have jihad, you have war, you have conflict, you have fighting, which we don't see the Imams do that much. And obviously Abu Abdullah is not a man who's invading places, he is defending himself. But the point we're making is he did raise his sword, whereas other Imams did not in the same way. So what they say is you have two approaches, Hassani and Husseini approach. In the Husseini approach, we have Abu Abdullah, and arguably we have Amir al-Mu'mineen in his time. But then in the Hassani approach is the majority of the Imams. The Imams, Imam Baqir and Masadiq, in their education, the way that they were teaching. Imam Zayn al-Abidin, after Karbala, that he didn't join the movements of the Tawabin after. Like he focused on dua and education. Then we have Imam Rida alayhi salam, who when he gets a level of political power, he doesn't use it to usurp the Khalifa and take control. He uses it to teach about wilaya and establish Islam from the voice of Khilafah in a different way. And then you have the future Imams who are in taqiyya, like you mentioned, and we have this underground network, the Wakala system, in which now the Imams are no longer openly calling for jihad, but they are guiding the Ummah through a series of representatives, so that when our Imam's Dhuhr comes, we are used to the idea that you go to a representative of the Imam and not the Imam himself. So this transition, some people say this is linked to politics because the Husseini approach is the activist approach and, you know, the revolution of Iran and all these things. The Hassani approach is the calm, silent taqiyya. However, in many ways, the Husseini approach is as wise as the Hassani approach, and the Hassani approach is as revolutionary as the Husseini approach. It just depends on the circumstance of which method does the Imam need for Islam to survive. So if Islam needs us to be in taqiyya or do conciliation or sign a peace treaty or accept living under governments which are taghut in our eyes, if that's how Islam needs to survive, then it requires great courage and bravery to not just follow our emotion and make a movement which the Imams would not agree with. Similarly, the decision to have a revolution, the decision to go to war, the decision to defend your land, to actually fight, requires wisdom, requires thinking. In one narration, people went to the Holy Prophet ﷺ and were praising a companion who was very brave and doing much activism. Activism meaning he was very active in his behavior, you know, visual signs of bravery. And the Prophet responds, وَكَيْفٌ أَقْلٌ الرِّجَالُ? How is the reason of this man? Does he use his mind? The Prophet's not concerned with the zahir about how active he is. He's thinking, but has he used his mind in coming to this decision? Implying that for us to be active and do acts and be an activist requires thought and thinking. And the Hassan Husseini approach is in truth just one. To support this view, Ayatollah Khamenei, in his masterpiece, The 250-Year-Old Man, argues that all of the Imams belong to one spiritual personality, which extended from the first Imam to the 12th Imam, before and after as well, but this time period of about 250 years. And in that time period, look at it as one person who was adapting his social political method based on his environment. When he's in power as Khalifa, he acts in a certain way. When the Muslims abandon him, he acts in another way. When he's forced from his home and forced to give bay'ah to a fasiq, he acts in a different way. When he returns and the ummah is shifting, he acts in a different way. When there's a change in the power from Banu Umayyah to Banu Abbas and there's a gap for education, he acts in a different way. Look at it as one personality. And all of it is revolutionary and all of it is wise. So that's the Imamate period. Okay, then we stop. What happens after is people using the Imamate period to understand their own responsibility in their current time. So if we fast forward straight to the revolution in contemporary times, you know, the message of Imam Hussein is not silent. It exists today. It's alive today. There are people alive today who are following Yazid and praising Yazid. And there are people today who are mustadaf, like you mentioned, who are weak and who are oppressed because they will not leave Abu Abdullah from their tongue. And that's the very reason why they're in this situation. Like, if the people of Yemen were to leave Abu Abdullah, the bombing of this country would stop. But what did we see? We saw videos of them doing majalis even during the airstrikes. We saw this. And the Saudis see this too. If the people of Lebanon did not believe in the idea of Abu Abdullah inspiring their leaders, they would put down their arms like all of the other Arab countries around them, and they would not defend their country. And the land of Israel would extend far into South Lebanon, and it would extend into the greater projection they aim for. If the people of Iraq did not look at Abu Abdullah's shrine and see a message for them to act, this shrine would be like Baqi today. But the people around have taken wisdom from the message of that time period. And Imam Khomeini, when he's looking at Ashura, he sees a movement which continues today. And then that phrase develops from the works of Dr. Shariati and then Shaykh Mutahari, and then later on, which is Kullu yawmin ashura, kullu ardin karbala. This is not a hadith, it's a slogan. And the slogan is that there's always going to be a need to be Husseini today. And there's always will be followers of Yazid. In fact, we see this in our narrations. هذا يوم فرحت به آل زياد وآل مروان بقتلهم الحسين. This is the day of success for Banu Ziyad and Banu Umayyah today because of the killing of Abu Abdullah. وهذا يوم تبرقت به بنو أمية وابن كلة الإكباد. Today is a day in which Banu Umayyah and their children celebrate because they killed Abu Abdullah. Evidence of this, the same Kaaba which Abu Abdullah went to proclaim his wilayat is now in the hands of those who deny him and favor Yazid over him and will openly say this. And those who don't openly say it, they believe it in their aqidah, that we cannot judge between them, or we choose Yazid over Abu Abdullah. Na'udhu billah. Like we see, this is happening around us now. And we only have this awakened approach because of the spirits given to us by the revolution. So to conclude my answer, in the Imamate period, we see what it means to apply wisdom in taking stances and adapting to different situations to know what does Islam require of you. And Shi'i after this looked back at this time period and saw our Imams being dynamic in their stances, sometimes doing sulh, sometimes doing jihad, and said that we need to act like this too. And this inspired movements, but it also inspires us to be activists. And I hope later as we develop, we can start thinking what's my own individual responsibility, and we can transition from looking at states to looking at individuals, because I believe in the West, this is where our solution lies. But that is my answer to that question, Kazim.
No, definitely. And I think, particularly the point you made about the Shia communities in the Middle East, right? These past few years, right, since Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call them, right? Around that time they were formed, a lot of their ideologues and their leaders, they said that we're going to march into Karbala and Najaf and destroy your shrines and kill all of your people. And we saw this, right, in the 1800s with the first or second Saudi movement, where they pillaged Karbala and they killed, I think, around 5,000 people. We saw it with Baqi, and we saw it again. Yet Shias have such a love in our heart for Imam Hussein that even when there is a threat of death, we still say, Labbaik ya Hussein, and we go for ziyarah to his shrine. So I feel like as Shias, alhamdulillah, we have such a strong, fire and passion in our heart. And there is the hadith from the Prophet that I can't remember exactly, but it's that there is the fire in the heart of the believer, this love for Imam Hussein that will never diminish. And I find that very beautiful. And like you said, it has, invigorated many of our political movements. It encouraged a lot of the Islamic revolution as well, in terms of how the occasions of Ashura and Arba'in, for example, were used also as platforms through which to stand up against oppression. So I wanted to come on in a second to the example of Imam Hussein. But just before that, so we've got a comment here from brother Asad Jamil, who says that the practical implementation of the theory of Wilayat al-Faqih by Imam Khomeini brings us on the same page as Sunnis. This is very much a reflection of their interpretation of Ulul Amr. So briefly, could you maybe, if there is a distinction between our brothers in Ahlul Sunnah and the Shia view when it comes to sort of activism and, the tying of religion with politics?
So some people have said this. They have argued that Imam Khomeini was heavily influenced by Sayyid Qutb, who in his books Milestones and others argued for Islam to be implemented politically, and that the people become ulul amr, they become the representatives of Allah on this earth by taking up roles. Now this view is not agreed in Sunnism, because in Sunnism there's also the view that it's haram to uprise against the ruler of the time. We don't have this view in Shiism, but they do in Sunnism. So some people argue that it's only by that debate being solved by Sayyid Qutb that people like Imam Khomeini, who did refer back to that time, were able to do this. However, even if it looks like that in form, it's very different to that in ijtihad. Imam Khomeini uses Quran very differently than the Sunnis will use to argue for a state. Even that verse of Quran, Ulul Amr minkum, that Allah wa Rasul Ulul Amr minkum wa la tanazahu, and do not dispute, obey, follow Allah, follow the Rasul and those in authority amongst you. We look at this as the authority of our Imam Zamana, and then we abstract the authority of the faqih as a representative of the imam, of the 12th imam. That's where we get it, one of the ways we get it from. That's not found in Sunni theology. That's not their approach. Their approach is different. It's more about establishing a khilafat based on the need for a khalifa now, because they have khulafa. We don't believe khulafa is the main reason for authority. We believe imamat is the main reason for authority. So to the dear brother, I would say that if we find similarities in form, there is definitely difference in nature. And the difference in nature comes from the fiqh interpretation of these views. Even though it does look similar in form, I agree. Sometimes you look at what one scholar says and what Imam Khomeini says, and they look really similar passages of text about revolution and ending Jahiliyyah and Rasulullah today, but really the ijtihad is very different. So that's how I would answer that point.
Thank you very much. Your father actually, our respected brother Abid Farshuri has said that in this given perspective, is it not fair to say that whilst the environment was conducive for uprising, Imam Khomeini chose the Husseini stance, whereas Ayatollah Khomeini adopted the Hassani approaches, conditions did not permit the uprising?
So this is one view, but remember there are also fiqh disagreements between Imam Khomeini and Ayatollah Khomeini as well. So it's not clear that if Ayatollah Khomeini was in the position of Imam Khomeini right now, at that time he would have done the same thing, because he simply did not believe in the extension of the power of the faqih in the same way. So it's unclear. And even the students of Ayatollah Khomeini, they disagree about this point. Some I have seen argue that Ayatollah Khomeini would have agreed with this comment, that agreed with what I'm saying, that Ayatollah Khomeini was just acting on the circumstance and his circumstance was different. Others argue no, Ayatollah Khomeini did not actually believe that the responsibility of the Shi'i was to establish a state in this way. Maybe there are other ways he would have implemented the idea of the faqih taking more of a role in society. For example, Ayatollah Sistani, he's more powerful now than any government of Iraq, but he does not hold any formal role. What I will answer to that point is, bear in mind that both of these roles are revolutionary. Said Sistani's so-called quietism, which is not really quietism, it's just selective speech, is revolutionary. It is activist. It is Husseini. So is his silence. And similarly, Ayatollah Khamenei today's stances and patience and decisions and places he extends and places he stops is also from wisdom. It is from wisdom that he decides not to respond to the martyrdom of Shaheed Qasim Soleimani and Shaheed Mehdi as that we need to fight them back. There's wisdom in his stance. So many people were calling for jihad at that time, but he decided it was not appropriate. So I don't say one is Hassani, one is Husseini. We say they are both Husseini in the way that we understand ijtihad, but it's a very good comment. They both have different jurisprudential backgrounds, and it's unclear still, and no one should claim that Ayatollah Khomeini was a follower of Walayat al-Faqih, and no one should say that he was against Walayat al-Faqih. It's not that clear. This is a fiqh discussion. It's not a political discussion.
Great, thank you. So I think in terms of now moving on, because I have seen a couple of questions which we'll come to in terms of sort of us as individuals and as local communities. We may not have an Ayatollah Khomeini that's on our doorstep that's encouraging us to revolt against Boris Johnson, for example. That's not going to happen. Or in the US against Biden.
You will get us cancers. Don't say things like this.
Okay. Well, there we go. It's definitely not going to happen. So there you go. But yeah, so I think in terms of, and we've discussed a lot today about the tragedy of Karbala, the struggle of Imam Hussein for social and political justice. And it does feel like every Muharram, we commemorate the tragedy of Ashura. We have these 10 days, we do matam, we cry, and that we, perform ziyarah all the way for 40 days. But often it can feel, and I tell myself first, that we often come away from this thinking of this as a historical thing, crying because of the, for example, the thawab that we're going to gain, right? From a lot of this, and this promise that we have to, there's this line of poetry, the slogan, Abad, Wallah ya Zahra man insa Husseina, that, oh Bibi Fatima, that we're not going to forget the tragedy of your son Hussein. But how can we translate the struggle of Imam Hussein into our own struggle as a community against today's atrocities? How much inspiration should we be taking? It might not be to, wage some form of jihad, and I say jihad like this because of the way that it's been manipulated nowadays. But even as individuals, and this is one question that the sister has mentioned, which I'll ask a little bit more in a second. Yeah, how can we, you know, when we say kullu yawmin ashura, kullu arudin karbala, how can we implement that in our own daily lives when we see what's going on around us?
So I definitely agree that we need to take inspiration from Abu Abdullah for this, because if it's true that kullu yawmin ashura kullu arudin karbala in terms of a slogan, it's also true that la yawm yawmaka ya Abu Abdullah, as Imam al-Hassan says to Imam al-Hussein on his deathbed, there's no day like your day, ya Abu Abdullah, which implies that whatever we're going to learn now, we have to get it from Imam al-Hussein in this way. And even Ayatollah Khomeini said this, that everything we have is from Ashura. Like, we have to go back. How we apply it to ourselves as individuals is interesting. There are so many answers to this. One is the idea of Islah and reform. That when Abu Abdullah says that I'm setting out not for rebellion and not for mischief, but Islah, Ummi Jadi Rasulullah, Ummati Jadi Rasulullah. I'm going out to reform the Ummah of my grandfather Rasulullah. We also have that same reform. We have to complete it. We have to continue it. That's one approach. Another approach is when the Imam speaks about wilaya. We have an Imam today now who we owe wilaya to. And our Imam today is the upriser, who is the one who will, who's the one who will seek revenge for the blood that was spilled on Karbala. So I have an Imam now who's linked to that struggle, and I've got to go back. And there are many ways of linking ourselves back to that time. Or just in having a personal relation to Abu Abdullah, where you know Imam al-Hussein, you know him, you know, you're going for his ziyarah, you're whispering to him in your dua, you are crying for him. And so you get to know what kind of person he is. And as our ulama say, every time you say Assalamu alaikum ya Abu Abdullah, the Imam responds wa alaikum salam. Now, we can't always hear it, and some ulama have been able to hear it, but our Imam is alive and he responds to us in this way. And so if I have a relationship to him, I owe him certain things and he expects certain things from me. This is a dynamic relationship, just like with Imam of our time, or the Imam of our time is on this earth now. So it's a lot more direct, even though there's ghaiba. But with Abu Abdullah and with the Ashab and the Shuhada of Karbala, I should have a relationship where I know them and where I feel like they see me in my honest form. So when I cry in a majlis, I'm crying when they hear that, Ya Abu Abdullah, witness my tears. And when I have fallen short, I genuinely believe and pray that you, for the sake of these tears, will step in and intervene from me going to where adl requires I go. And rather you will supplicate for me that I receive raham. Like, these are dynamic ways of looking at it. Here's one way that I would like to add to these points about being an activist. All of us should look at Imam al-Hussein and through his message decide I should be an activist for my current social political issues. And here's how. We are told that activism in the Islamic tradition, where is it? Where is the word activist? Where does it exist? One view that I like is in the word shahid, which all of us are meant to be a witness of Allah. Okay? Sheikh Shumali argues that wise activism means that when you are a shahid of Allah, where you witness Allah, you acknowledge him. When other people recognize that you are one who witnesses Allah, that's what we call activism. So if someone else knows you and they know that you believe in this stance or that stance and that stance, and it comes from your love of Allah, then you are an activist. For example, if you believe that there's haqqullah and haqqun nas, that we have the right of God, and from the right of God, I understand what is my duty to other people, then you have become a shahid of Allah. If you believe in insaf Allah wa insaf nas, like in Nahj al-Balagha, which we discussed in the Wednesday's Nahj al-Balagha book club on Malik al-Ashtar's letter 53 of the Imam sends to him, that you have to know the rights to God, and once you know the rights of God, you will then understand what are your rights to his makhluq, his creation. This is being a shahid, being a witness, where I'm now witnessing God in my amal. This means you're an activist. Then the shahid can become a shaheed, a martyr. And shaheed comes from the same letters for shahid. So one of the meanings of a person who is a martyr is someone who witnesses Allah in their death and their life. This is why Dr. Shariati says that a shaheed is the one whose blood becomes a witness of Allah. That's a shaheed. And he argues that blood is the lifeblood of the qawm. It keeps it alive and breathing. This is the blood of the martyrs. This is such a good template for us. That if I'm looking at Abu Abdullah, who is the first Shaheed, the main Shaheed, the Shaheed Sayyid al-Shuhada, I recognize that in him. I say, Abu Abdullah, I bear witness that you witnessed Allah. Ashhadu anna qad aqamta salat wa atayta zakat. I bear witness that you established prayer and charity in your amal. By doing this, I would like people to witness me as someone who witnesses Allah. Maybe it's because I serve at a mawqib on the Arba'in Julus. Maybe it's because I recite poetry for Abu Abdullah. Maybe it's because I donate to homeless people or volunteer in a hospital, or I'm kind to my neighbors. If people look at my amal salih and linking back to my rights to Allah, I've become a shahid. And if I die in a situation which counts as shaheed, I've died as a witness of Allah. An activist exists in this gap, in this group of being a witness of God. Similarly, if you die in this state, you are dying as an activist. This is a very specific form of making your amal for the sake of Allah. Because what it means, and this is really important, if any of us are engaging in social political activities, if we're calling for change, if we're doing anything, writing to your MP or going to the food drive, any of this stuff, I have to question, where did I get that niyat from? That niyat needs to be from Allah. It can't be because the Conservative Party, I'm opposing them, or because I studied liberalism in school, or because I'm a socialist and I believe in supporting socialist countries. I can't use that as my, those things can be true, but that can't be my niyat. My niyat must be Allah, because then my amal is linked back to him. If my amal is linked back to him, then as Imam Sadiq says, be in such a way that people should look at you and see you as an ornament for us, not a disgrace for us. Laysa dhilla, and you're not a disgrace to us, you are an ornament. They look at you and they praise us. The moment this circuit is closed, where I have a niyat for Allah and amal for Allah, and people recognize this, I become an activist in any amal, even in worship, even in prayer, worship in the narrow sense, in literally praying. You become a shahid of Allah. And if you're establishing prayer in another country, same thing. Migrating to a new country, you become shahid of Allah. This is activism. All of us can learn from Abu Abdullah in doing this for ourselves. That Imam al-Hussein was the shahid of Allah, and I bear witness he did everything for God. Let me be like that, where my niyat is for Allah. And the moment one other person recognizes this in me, I've become a public activist. I've shown my shahada in public. And that then leads to politics and, being a shaheed and all those things. So in answer to your question, we can look at reform, we can look at our duty to Imam Zamana, but I will argue to all of you that I will suggest to all of you, consider yourself as a shahid of Allah, and from that shahada of Allah, you link all of your amal back to that. And inshallah, that's a really positive way to be a activist for the sake of Allah.
Yeah, and I received a very lovely question that sort of touches on the subject of God centricity and taqwa, in that sort of, as activists, right? Our goal should always be to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to get closer to him, right? And I think a lot of what you mentioned in terms of how Imam Hussein was struggling for Islah, and that eventually, when you look at these very powerful stories of the Imam doing sujood on the battlefield, of the verses of Surah Fajr, which I recited at the beginning, Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'inna, right? Oh, contented, oh, serene soul. I think that's very much also our goal as well, that Imam Hussein was ultimately doing everything to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though the way that he did things to lay his life down in battle was very different to what many of us might have to do. But I definitely think that there is a role there. There are a couple of questions here that are very important, but also maybe quite sort of pessimistic. And it's actually something that I almost tend to agree with. And I'll let you jump in as well. But firstly, as individuals, do you think that we're doing enough as individuals or as a community to voice our concerns to the wider community and the media? Surely involves ourselves, empowering ourselves with knowledge, and then being much more active on social media whenever we see Muslims and Islam being targeted. So in terms of my response to that, I think, yes, we don't seem to be doing enough. We seem to be resting on our laurels because we see that maybe we're in the West, we take the fact that we can commemorate Ashura, for example, and hold our milads and jashns and things like that. We take that for granted. We don't necessarily know what our brothers and sisters in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Lebanon are going through and have been going through for centuries. So it seems that because we're in the West, we're very content with sort of our lives and how our lives are. I think from my perspective, I think the first step is to make yourself aware. So keeping abreast of what's going on in the world and also speaking to your kids, not being afraid. We often have this term thrown around like, dirty politics, but that's what makes the world go around. And it's the decisions of political leaders that lead to a lot of these outcomes that we're seeing, whether they're positive or negative. It would be great if we could see more of our community. And this is what we've tried to do at AMN with the Politics Club, is to try and raise awareness and understanding and independence. So not just listening to what the media tells you, because a lot of the time we can't just rely on the media, but actually reading, around the topic, which is something I tell myself I need to do. And I've been trying to do a little bit more. And when you're doing a master's, you don't really have a choice but to read, right? About the amount of articles and books and whatnot that our professors give us. It's difficult, but the first verse of the Quran was Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, right? Read. And we often tend to forget that, including myself. And whilst we may often, want to push our children into these, careers as a GP or a pharmacist or an optometrist or a lawyer, and these are all very great careers and professions that society needs in order to function. I also think that we need more of our youth becoming journalists, becoming researchers, becoming academics that have such knowledge of the issue that can then gain a platform with which to inform the wider public about what's going on in Palestine, what's going on, in terms of the Shia genocide that is taking place around the world. So that's what I would say. Abbas, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that point in terms of what we're doing, what we can do.
Yeah, so what went well first, and then even better if. So for what we are doing well is we have resources and we have positive energy. So this wasn't necessarily the case. Like even within my lifetime, I've seen a change in the number of projects we have, number of political projects, the number of Assalamu alaikum and uncle, in the political projects we have, in the organizations, in the, it seems like we have more resources. And in addition to that, what we do also have is we have a very positive energy of wanting to do things. We have that energy. People no longer ask, can Islam be political? They used to ask this a lot many years ago, but I feel like we've made good progress in that discussion. When we're seeing actual governments oppress Shi'i, we get that we have to engage in politics. So that's true. What we also have is, so that's what we're doing good. What we don't have is balance and organization. So in terms of organization first, although I mentioned it second, we have Shi'i in very prominent political and influential positions right now. We have mu'mineen in positions of power. We have mu'mineen, some of whom are in taqiyya, in the highest level of government in the West. We have them in the United Nations, in DC, in Downing Street. They exist. What we don't have is coordination amongst ourselves to utilize the resources that we have in the best possible way. Where we think that a message will be put out if we use WhatsApp more than if we appeal to policymakers. The number of people who go and write to the MP is so little compared to those who will show up at a protest, whereas statistically, reaching out to policymakers in a certain way is just more effective. So we don't have that organization. We have resources, but we have not pooled together to utilize what we have already. And like you mentioned, if we have children, we have not encouraged them for the right roles, for example. If we have some people in the right roles, we've not encouraged them to take the right stances or to link them back to the right scholars. If we have scholars who are good in certain topics and key areas, we've not made plans for our communities to know which ideas do they need now for tarbiyah, which ideas next and next and next. Ask yourself in your idara, your Husseiniya, your centers, if there is not a common theme in the scholars being invited to the center, then all of the work being done begins and ends from day 1 to 10 in Muharram. Then another speaker comes and tries his approach, and another one, and everything begins and ends in that time. Maybe I take one or two good points, but there's no project. But if I'm inviting ulama or scholars or focusing on topics and themes which serve a longer period of time, like some centers do, over 5 years, we're going to focus on this area, or we're only going to call scholars who have this approach because we want to improve this in our youth, for example. Then we have coordination. There are many examples of the coordination. Another thing we don't have is balance. So what we have, and I mentioned this in a Facebook post not long ago, is an imbalance between theory and practice. So sometimes our activists, or forget activists, sometimes we are very much inclined towards Shabi Qadr, Majalis Imam al-Hussein, going on, julus, reading Quran, discussing ilm like this. But when there is a protest or when there is a need for activism, those people who are the first in line to pray in Jama'ah are the last in line at the demonstration for Al-Quds. Then we have the opposite. We have those who are so activist and going to so many events and speaking with non-Muslims and doing these activities, but they sometimes lack their own personal spirituality to be ambassadors for us in the full sense. So maybe they speak for us on issues like who we should vote for in an election, but they don't speak for me when it comes to what does Imam Ali teach you about akhlaq, because you don't have it in you. We don't have that balance between theory and practice. And the truth is, and we learn this actually from Sayyidah Fatima sallallahu alayha, in the example of hers, that the one who prays the lengthiest salat, which she did during the night, is the same person who will advocate for the rights of haqq in public when the need arises. She is both our mother in worship and our mother in strength and izzah and honor. Same for Imam Ali alayhi salam. He could be considered a zahid, a man who abstained from dunya, a man of worship, and he is the lion on the battlefield, the bravest warrior who would destroy enemies with a glance, let alone a sword. One man who can do both. We need balance between theory and practice, internal worship and external worship. And until we get this, our activism will always be limited. Either it will be we're talking to the same people on the same WhatsApp groups in the same centers, we're not expanding outside, or those who are going outside don't represent us. So we don't see any change inside of us by them going out. And that's the problem that we have. So what went well? We have energy, we have passion, we have imams, we have Ahlul Bayt who we are living and breathing with us. What we need to do more of is organize our resources and develop plans for our own tarbiyah in ourselves and our youth to implement this in a long-lasting way, not just in a limited way.
Thank you very much.
Can I say a few words, please?
Please, Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Sorry, I didn't want to just interrupt you.
No, please, you're very welcome. How are you?
I was sort of trying to hold my hand out because I want to say a few words.
Yes, of course.
There were two messages which I read with interest. One was of Sister Zahra Hussain, and the last one, which just came a few seconds ago from Abid Farshuri. What my contribution is from slightly different angle. Zahra's question was very valid, that what are we doing as an individual or as a community? My view is there are very, very few people, a few youngsters like yourselves, who are doing a very good job of serving the community, guiding us and so on and so forth. But what we are lacking, which Abid mentioned in his message, our reader's message, says we lack dynamic leadership in our community at different levels. Now, what I was going to say is not about different levels. What I was going to say is that in UK, we need a leader. We lack leadership because even in Iran, there were many ulama, marja, taqlid, and so on, but Imam Khomeini decided to take on the leadership. And the quality of a leader should be that he is selfless. And he was selfless, yet he succeeded. In Pakistan, this is well before you guys were born, in the 70s, we had a leader called Allama Rashid Turabi. He was so powerful. He was a zakir. He wasn't even, he didn't have any imam or anything. But he was so powerful and he had the leadership in him that one Muharram, the Urdu newspaper called Jang published something against Imam Ali. So he didn't ask the public, he used to address the largest majlis in Karachi. He didn't ask the public, please don't buy the newspaper. He said very authoritatively, you are not going to buy Jang newspaper from tomorrow. End of story. Nobody did. And within 3 or 4 days, Jang newspaper published an apology. Now, this is on one side. On the other side, I can't remember the year, but on Radio Park, on Pakistan TV, something was said which was against our Imams or Imam Ali or something against Shias. And there was a danger that people would go and attack the Radio Pakistan, Pakistan TV. So he said in his speech, which I heard recently, that we are Hussainis. We don't go setting fire to the cars. We don't go breaking the windows of the buildings. We can gather, he said, I can gather 100,000 signatures today from this majlis. So that's how we do. So he stopped, a trouble which could have happened. And on the other hand, he made the newspaper publish an apology. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we had a leader in Pakistan. Similarly, here in UK, in Khoja community, we had a great leader called Mullah Asghar. Whatever he said, it went. Everyone followed because he was a very strong leader. You all have heard the name of Ayatollah Mohsin Hakim Tabatabai. One of his sons, Agha Mehdi Hakim Tabatabai, was in UK for a few years. Then he was martyred by Saddam. He was a leader. So basically, just giving you this background, that we need a leadership. And how do we find the leadership, and what do we do to get the leadership? We, at the moment, I mean, I'm not trying to, praise or put Maulana Ariza's name forward, but he is the president of Shia Ulama Council of Shia Ulama. Whether it is him or whoever, if we strengthen the leader, if us, the community, strengthen the leader and say, you guide us, then you, me, Kazim, whoever, we can support him, the whole community can support him, and he can guide us to do all the things that are mentioned in these messages. Because without a leader, singularly, as you all heard, it's easy to bend or break one single stick. But if there are 10 sticks together, you can't bend them. So if we are a strong community under a strong leadership, we can take our voice to the government, to whichever department, to European Council, to UN or wherever. But the leader should be strong enough to know that the community is following him and supporting him. So basically, that's my view that I wanted to say, that we have good people. We may have good people in place of power, but one thing we lack is leadership. And once we have a strong leadership, we can go forward.
Ahsant. It's a beautiful point, and I agree completely.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a shame that there is Sister Kulsum with her hand up. I'll come to her in a second. It's a shame that we're coming towards the end of the session and now people are kind of opening up a little bit more, but this is exactly what we want. And I completely agree with you, Uncle, in the sense that, we've got many of our, local scholars, many of whom, have been born and brought up in the West, who the youth can relate to. They've got hundreds of thousands of followers on social media. Some like Sheikh Azhar Nasir, Sayyid Hussein Makki have been doing great work, in terms of raising awareness of the plight of Muslims and Shias, and many of them might be followed even, for Sheikh Azhar, I think a few days ago I was going through those that follow him, and you have many non-Shias that actually follow him that might not be necessarily aware of a lot of the issues that are going on, but they've gravitated towards him because of the fact that he's speaking about a lot of these sort of universally important issues. So I think definitely we should be using these platforms, and our scholars should continue to use these platforms, inshallah. Sister Kulsum, thank you for being so patient. I know you've got your hand raised. If you would like to ask your question or comment, please feel free to do so, inshallah. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Kazim, Brother Abbas.
Alaikum salam.
I have a question, but it's sort of long-winded. So when we're trying to create change, there are sort of two avenues that we can go down. We can either look at it and work within the structures that are already here. So like on the most basic level, voting, on, if you go further down that path, becoming a politician, working to build your career within these more important branches, law and politics, etc., etc. And then there's the other avenue, which is going outside of these structures, trying to protest, etc., working with charities, things like that. Which does Islam take as the more important or the more useful avenue? Which one do you think would be, which one creates the better change? Because while working within the structures potentially allows you to work faster or to work more effectively in some ways, in other ways you end up having to curb or water down or compromise, or in order to create one good change you have to accept one bad thing. Mm-hmm. But obviously working within charity, that's not necessarily, a lot of money goes into nothing a lot of the time. So that's my question.
It's such a good question, because we have some who believe that we need to take a very anti-establishment route in, which is I think what you're referring to, where we are mounting an external critique to the system and we're arguing against the system. So whether it's on the basis of Islam or in general, postmodernism or anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism, like we need to come from the outside in and destroy the system and rebuild it in the right way. And some believe, no, we have to work from the inside to build our representation, build our strength, and reform from within. And both are there for the 12th Imam, that when he comes, either we've reformed these institutions for him, or we have weakened the institutions for him to replace them. وَقَدْ مَلَأْتُ الْأَرْضُ عَدْلًا. He will establish adl on the earth. We've helped him in that role. My answer to you is we have examples of both, but it depends on the individual. So if we have someone like Ali bin Yaqtin in the time of Imam al-Qa'id, Imam al-Rida, who is told by the Imams to go into government and do taqiyya, but help the mu'mineen from within, as far as he's allowed to, it becomes wajib for him, it becomes his obligation that your role is to work from the inside. And it helps to have express declaration from an Imam to know that's allowed, especially if it's like Banu Abbas who are oppressing mu'mineen, or in this case, governments which are oppressing us. But as long as the individual is able to help the mu'mineen from the within, he's allowed to take that role. And we're told to ask ulama for guidance on these issues. The moment that them being in that role is acting against the community, for example, they're being used by non-Muslims or non-Shi'i as a face of policies which are against us, then they are no longer allowed to be in that role. At the same time, we are also told to criticize the system, not just the people in the system. So we're arguing against the whole nizam, the system itself, not just this government or that government, but the whole idea that ghair of the Imam can be the authority over us. We don't even agree with that as a principle. Similarly, when we speak about Abu Abdullah, we're talking about we're talking about the actual foundations of the dhulm which happened to him, not just Yazid, but who came before him, what the system was after Saqifa, and it's the whole system. So a part of the Islamic struggle is to have a systemic approach, an anti-systemic approach. But my answer to you to the system, it's such a good question, is each individual has their own responsibility based on what they can contribute. If they are able to do the first, working within the system, there is a place for that in Islam. And if they're able to do the latter of making that systemic critique, we also have an approach there. So it depends on the role of the individual, is my answer to you on that point.
Santum, Brother Abbas, and thank you very much, Sister Kulsum, for that great question. We are obviously approaching Maghrib time, and we don't want to keep you for too long. So inshallah, we'll begin to wrap up. So I do apologize. There were maybe a few questions that we didn't quite come to.
How many? Sorry, Kazim. How many minutes do we have? How long do we have until Maghrib?
I believe it's 9:37. So we've got half an hour technically, but I'm just conscious of people's commitments. If you wish to continue the discussion,
if people are engaging and they're listening, then we can continue, but not until at the edge. But there's a few more points I think we can go through from
no problem.
No problem.
Inshallah. Okay, great. I've got so many messages. It's like trying to go through all of them could be a bit of a problem. But there was one question from Brother Ali who asked us right at the beginning. I was just sort of waiting for the right time to bring this in. So Brother Ali said, Salam, what is the Islamic viewpoint of the activists from Palestinian Action who are taking direct action on Elbit system? So I think I just checked this up. So I think they're an Israeli defense company. Often the activists are non-Muslims. Is this something Muslims should do to raise awareness of what Elbit systems are doing? So if I could just provide my viewpoint, you see many of these, large arms manufacturers from Israel, from the UK, like BAE, for example. In the US, you see Boeing, you see Raytheon, and many of these, for example, when, for example, the US government and the Saudi government, make an arms deal, for example, you see many of these defense contractors that are actually manufacturing the weapons that are then used, for example, by the Saudi Air Force. We call them an Air Force, but they're so badly trained, they end up hitting everywhere else. So I use that term loosely. The Saudi Air Force then uses this equipment. So you do see a lot of Western companies that are directly supporting or that are complicit and profiteering very much from a lot of the conflicts. And we've all heard a lot about Blackwater, for example, and the role that it played during the Iraqi civil war in terms of perpetrating a lot of deaths there, Sunni and Shia as well. In terms of the particular point of the fact that the activists are non-Muslims, you see many, for example, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, you see many Jews, and I've had like Jewish friends. I've got a really good Jewish friend actually who studied with me during my undergraduate degree, and now he's at Oxford, and he's engaged in a lot of great research and activism. And you'll often see him posting on Twitter, against the recent, for example, the annexation of settlements, or the annexation of the West Bank through the building of settlements, the eviction, the forcing out of people from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, speaking out against these things. So you actually often see non-Muslims that tend to take up a very, very sort of active stance in relation to issues that are affecting Muslims, whereas a lot of us tend to be very quiet, in terms of these issues. And like I said, the flip side is a lot of, governments. For example, you look at, Imran Khan's response to the Hazara genocide. You've got a large Hazara community in northern Pakistan, and they've often been targeted by the Salafi jihadi groups in Pakistan. And when the Hazara community, invited him to the northern regions to visit him in order to have a dialogue about the issue, he said, that don't blackmail me, right? As if there is some sort of a political thing. Whereas when it's kids and women dying, that's obviously not a political thing. So to me, it's irrespective of whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim. You often see a lot of hypocrisy where there are Muslim governments or Muslim leaders that don't speak out for sort of humanitarian rights in general, let alone sort of Muslim rights specifically. And then you often see many non-Muslims that do tend to speak out, and take a stance on many of these issues. I don't know, Abbas, if you've got anything to add on that.
No, that was sufficient. Just to conclude, to add that these stances require wisdom, and we're going to have to make alliances with people who believe in things that we might be uncomfortable with. I'm not saying that about arms dealing, but in general, like, they might not believe in our principles. And as long as we're not being used by them or being swayed by them, and they support our cause, we can work with them. There is a place for amal bil-ma'ruf and nahi anil munkar. There is a place for that, but there's also a method of that. And it should not be done at a way which is the cost of our survival, especially if for Palestine, where we're going to have so many different people we're working together with. So it requires an inclusive approach, a diplomatic approach, sometimes a wise approach, and one which is selective in communication. So that's all I was going to add.
Agreed. And there was a further question, and we did touch on this a little bit earlier, obviously, when it comes to leadership, which Brother Ja'far mentioned, and he's just said that, asking to strengthen the leadership. And I do agree that we do have the leadership there. We've got the resources and the facilities. Maybe we're just not using it or taking advantage of it in the right way. So there's been a question from Brother Ali, I would assume the same, Brother Ali, who said that generally speaking, our mosques and Husseinias are very quiet on the topic of political activism. Given the current global climate, why do you think this is, and what should we do about this? I'll let you answer, and then I'm happy to jump in, inshallah.
On the one hand, ulama have a role in this, especially to link some of these points in a practical way. I remember that Huz Hussein was only formed when, I think it was Sheikh Ja'far in Istanbul mentioned it on the minbar once, that there should be something called Huz Hussein, where we talk to the world about Huz Hussein. He just said it like that. And after that, the youth started thinking, well, let's actually outdo Amal, and look at what's become now. And that came from one statement on the minbar, which I don't even think he knew the extent that it would have caused. So there's a role for minbar. But we cannot expect the ulama to be experts in, all of them to be experts in politics. Some will have some expertise in some issues, but they will not all be Imam Khomeini. We have to do that on ourselves. We need journalists, we need policymakers, we need activists, we need spokespeople, we need people in corporations. This is not on the ulama. This part is on us. What we need either is an alim, a scholar who understands these issues and can advise us on them when it comes to ikhtilaf, so we know we're following the Sharia, or at least they allow and give space for the community to do these things, and they don't get in the way by arguing on very parochial lines, or that there's no such thing as some politics and these things. That doesn't help. But in answer to your question, yes, we need more from Mimbar, but honestly, when I mentioned theory and practice, we need this link together. We haven't done all the work for theory either. Like we're not perfect worshippers who are ready to take this responsibility. We haven't even done the groundwork in many issues yet, where people are not paying khums, or people are not praying, or people are still asking about things like moon sighting as if their whole deen depends on this. We're not ready for a lot of issues that we are asking for us. So our ulama, in going through the Quran and the prophets and these stories, does help us make our foundation firm. But you're right, after that part is done, in tarbiyah, you go into the next level. And what we need is someone, a scholar, who recognizes this and transitions us from looking at our sources to using our sources. And yeah, I agree on that point. We need more, but we need more in ourselves as well as the ulama.
Definitely. I think there is a relationship there whereby as individuals we need to sort of work, because it's individuals that will then sort of build the community up and provide these sorts of platforms as well.
And the ulama are from us, that they're from ourselves, they're from our communities. If we're not like this, the quality of scholarship is going to reflect that. There was a time when people went to Hausa, with all due respect, because they weren't sure what to do with their life, or because they weren't decided on what career path, and they thought about Hausa. That's not going to produce the type of expectation which we're talking about. Then there are some who go knowing they've got to come back to the West, and they look for things which they will use in the West, and we see the great work they're doing. So the scholars are from us. If we improve, Allahu la yughayyiru ma biqawmihim hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. If Allah will not change the condition of our community unless we change what's in ourselves. So if we do that hard work, the quality of scholarship will improve, and it is improving.
And to add to that, Sister Zahra made a very, very beautiful point where she said leadership will take time, but we have an individual responsibility to take up the issues of concern, which we can act on straight away. We cannot keep blaming community leaders, but we need to empower ourselves first, make our voices heard. And I do tend to agree with that. We can't expect everything to be given to us on a plate. And just to going back to the previous question again, and then inshallah we'll begin to wrap up with what Brother Ali said. You see that there is a very sort of toxic, a very, very anti-Islamic environment that has built up these past 2 years. And you even saw after the events, I think it was in last January, where we saw the martyrdom of Qasim Soleimani, of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis as well. And the Islamic Center of England, right, Maid of Vale, organized a commemorative program. And then after that, they had the Charities Commission breathing down their neck. And it often happens that a lot of our masajid and Husseinias are registered charities, which is great. And that's very, very important. But then that often also means that, to sort of they then have to subscribe to this very politicized protocol that the Charities Commission, as part of the government, then sets. And also when it comes to individual, alims as well, if it comes to speaking out against a certain government in the Middle East, or certain political leaders, they can offer fear for their own safety as well. So that can often be an issue. And so on the one sense, it can be a little bit of an issue or a hindrance, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't take that stance, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay, so before we sort of wrap up with the sort of final announcements, Abbas, did you want to leave us with any sort of closing remarks to take home today, inshallah?
Yeah, inshallah. So for those who shared, thank you so much. For those who listened, thank you as well for your engagement. This topic continues. It is in general, it's not a one event issue. This is an issue which we keep speaking about. How can we fulfill our responsibility? And I encourage everyone to link back to the sources to understand that. So what does the Imam want from you? What does Quran teach us? And this is a very healthy way to derive the right stances. So the more we build up on our understanding of the Imams, the Ahl Bayt, the Quran, and the ulama, and the way ijtihad works and all these things, the better equipped we are for this dialogue. So I encourage all of you, inshallah, in these months, education, keep learning, and then the right projects will become clear to you, which you should support based on your responsibility. And I pray that for all of us.
Inshallah. And obviously coming back to, the whole, and Ali Bhai just mentioned to me, and sort of, this sort of light bulb click, that even Al-Muntazir Network was formed after hearing a Maulana speak from the mimbar about the need for such an organization. So it does show that many, this particular alim, posited this view, that then led to the creation of Al-Muntazir Network, which in turn led to today's discussion. Inshallah, from this discussion, we can then, those of you that might have heard, this discussion, I've benefited a lot. I'm sure Abbas has also benefited, from hearing points of others, such as, Ja'far uncle and Sister Kulsum as well. Inshallah, we can all, take this away. And obviously AMN being named after Imam al-Mahdi ajalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif, we hope that all of this activism, that we're engaging in, raising awareness about the plight of our Muslim brothers and sisters, and other issues around the world as well in regards to humanitarianism, because obviously the Imam will come in order to eradicate all of this tyranny and this injustice. So inshallah, we hope that we're preparing the ground for his return, both as individuals and collectively as well. Inshallah. Okay, inshallah, just to add, and thank you very much for your kind words in the chat. Alhamdulillah, we're very, very fortunate to have those such as Brother Abbas that are so willing to support organizations such as AMN, and in terms of the Nahj al-Balagha series that Brother Abbas is running, maybe do you want to just mention a few words about that in terms of how people can watch?
Okay, so we looked at this issue quite recently in this week's Nahj al-Balagha book club, which happens every week. There are multiple groups. The Monday group is for the children of our community who are aged between 13 to 17 in that age group. The Tuesday group is for children of the Ahl Bayt Society, so students in university. The Wednesday group is the main group for everyone, and that's where we discussed Imam Ali's letter to Malik al-Arshda recently. Gardens put a link to one of the podcasts in general. If you subscribe to that page, you can then see all of the Nahj al-Balagha discussions, especially those related to politics. And you can follow along and you can follow live, and all the details are there. So please click the link that Gazim mentioned. And on Thursdays, there's the advanced session in which ulama dissect the topic in a more analytical way. To understand the words of how the Imam links to us today. That book club's running till the end of the 10 weeks, which is the first week of August. So, please join. And there are so many opportunities to touch the sources. This is just one, but there are many, and I encourage you to follow all of them. But click the link which Gazim put to see the Nahj al-Balagha book club, inshallah.
Inshallah, thank you very, very much. And may Allah reward you, Brother Abbas. Thank you very, very much for your time, for joining us. You're doing such amazing work, for the youth of our community, of which, you and I are still youth, alhamdulillah. And it's great that we've got this platforms like Al-Muntazir Network, through all of the amazing work that, goes on behind the scenes from all of the volunteers that I mentioned earlier, to be able to facilitate such discussions. Inshallah, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, that we'll be holding an Eid celebration, inshallah, on Friday, the 23rd of July, at 6:30 p.m. The location will be Shiraz Mirza Hall in Kingston. So inshallah, by then we'll all be able to meet each other and continue with these sorts of discussions, but in a physical environment, of course, you know, taking the necessary precautions and whatnot where necessary. Can we please just end with another Surah Al-Fatiha, because obviously for myself and Abbas, this has been quite an emotional, you know, topic, as interesting as it is to discuss, and for all of those that have been killed in Afghanistan, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Lebanon, you know, Yemen and Nigeria and elsewhere, please let's remember them with the Surah Al-Fatiha.